Hey there, iOS developers. Interested in finding out how to add Plaid to your native mobile app? Well, have I got a video for you? It's this one right here. So you're at the right place. I'm going to show you how to build a Plaid-powered iOS app, including some nifty OAuth flows that make use of universal links on today's episode of Plaid Academy. Okay, so we're going to do two things today. First, we'll get a basic application up and running that can make a call to the Plaid APIs. Now, this is going to be a full stack application, so you are going to have to do a little bit of server programming, but don't worry, we'll keep it pretty simple. Once that's done, we'll tackle the second part of getting a Plaid application running on iOS devices, and that's OAuth. Now, this will include steps like setting up universal links so you can handle app-to-app flows, which is a really neat experience where you can redirect users to a banking app on their device so they can sign in using something like Face ID. It is a little tricky, but it's worth it. By the way, if you already feel like you have a handle on the first part and are just here for the OAuth universal link stuff, feel free to skip to that part of the video, and the time code should be in the description below. Now, in terms of prerequisites for the first part of our tutorial, you're going to need the following. 1, a copy of Xcode, the command line tools, and all the usual iOS development requirements. 2, a copy of Node.js that you can use to run the server. Now, if you've never used Node before, don't worry, it's basically just JavaScript running on a backend server, and as long as you've got a solid engineering background, you'll be fine. But you will need to have Node installed. One way of doing this is to download it directly from the Node.js download page. This will also install NPM, which is a tool that you will need to install various libraries. I guess you can kind of think of it like CocoaPods. Although, to be honest, I might recommend looking into this tool called NVM instead to manage your Node installations. This is a nice little utility that you can use to easily install and switch between different Node versions, which is something that you might need to do now and again if you're doing any Node development. And I will add a link to that in the description below as well. Finally, you'll need an account at the Plaid dashboard, which you can sign up for at dashboard.plaid.com. Okay, ready? Let's get started. Now, in case you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, why all this business about like running Node.js in a server? I thought this was an iOS tutorial. Here's the thing. Unlike a lot of other applications where you might just hit the API directly from your phone while passing along an API key, nearly all the communication you'll be doing with Plaid will be from your server instead. And nearly every call you make to the Plaid service is going to include two things, your client ID and a secret. This combination lets us know that the application is really you and that it's okay for us to send you potentially sensitive financial information. And eventually it lets us know who to bill for these calls. So obviously this is not information you want to leak to a client. Also, if you think about it, in a real app where you're going to be like transferring money around or approving users for a loan, those are the kinds of sensitive decisions that you don't want to be making on an untrusted environment like a client. Therefore, just about every call you make to the Plaid API will be done from your server. So first, let's get a starter application up and running to make sure that we are all on the same page. And yes, I do recommend coding along with me if at all possible. Not only will you learn things a little better, but by the end of it, you will have some working code that you can then copy and paste into your own app. I should probably also point out the process that we are learning today is applicable to most Plaid products, but not all of them. For a few other products, maybe most notably identity verification, but also income, the process is a little different, and I would encourage you to check out the documentation to find out more. So first thing we're going to want to do is install our sample application. So I'm going to open up our tutorial resources GitHub page. You should find the link to this in the description below. And let's just copy our repo location. Now at this point, I'll open a command line and I'll head into my favorite development folder. And now let's git clone this into, let's call it, I don't know, Plaid iOS video. We'll jump into here and then I'll jump into the iOS Swift start directory. And then let's jump into our server directory here. Now, I should note here that I'm using Node version 19, but I think this should work back at least as far as Node 16. And then I'm going to run npm I, or also npm install, and that will install all the libraries that are required to get our server up and running. And now if you look here, there it is. You see we have this env template file. We're going to need to copy that over to .env. And I'll explain why we're going to do this in a little bit. At this point, I can go ahead and open up our server directory using my favorite IDE. I'm going to go with VS Code, but you do whatever you'd like. Now, at this point, we can open up our env file, and let's just make sure that our user ID is something we like. I'm going to go with 1 because I'm not feeling particularly creative. As for these other values, we will get to these shortly. You can ignore them for now. So now I'm going to open up a terminal window. I'm going to do this within my IDE, and we're going to make sure that we are in our server directory, and then we're going to type npm run watch. And what this is going to do is this is basically going to run a little process that is going to run our server.js file. And it will go ahead and sort of restart the server anytime we make changes in any of our code files. So you don't really have to worry about restarting your server every time we make an edit. It'll just sort of happen automatically. And you can see that our server is now up and running on localhost 8000. And well, that's our server down. Time to move on to the client. Let me jump back into my command line here, and I'm just going to go into the client directory. I'm going to go ahead and just open up this project in Xcode. If you want, feel free to change this bundle ID to something that's more appropriate for you. Let's call this, com.plaid.video1, because that's what this is. Later on in this tutorial, you're probably going to want to switch to a real development team, preferably one where you're actually paying for the $99 a year developer plan. But we'll talk more about this later when we get to OAuth and universal links. For now, I'm just going to run this locally on a simulator to make sure that everything seems to be up and running. And if all has gone well, after a little while, we should get a screen like this where it says, hello, user 1. And you can see here in my debug output that it has actually made a call to our get user info endpoint on our server, and it has received some basic information about our user, that we are not connected to a bank and that our user ID is 1. That's what we use to fill out that little line of text right there. So great, we have our application up and running. So let me just give you a quick lay of the land in terms of how the code is structured and where some of the important methods are. First, let's look at our server. And on the server side, nearly all the code that you're going to need is here in our server.js file. There's a little code up here at the top that starts our server using a library called Express. There's a whole bunch of endpoints that don't really do a lot of anything because all the code is commented out. And then at the bottom here, here's just a little bit of error handling. All the user-centered logic, all the logic to retrieve and save your user information has been moved into this user utils file. And I kind of stuck this in a separate file because the implementation here isn't really relevant to what we're learning about today. If you really want to take a look, you can see that we're basically storing our user information by saving it to a flat file. And we can see that when I retrieve information about our user, we are determining the ID of our logged in user by looking at an environment variable, right? In a real application, we'd probably be using an actual database and using a real sign-in system. But just for simplicity, this works fine for our needs. We don't need to worry about installing a database and all the libraries that entails. So that's our server. If we jump on over to Xcode, we can look at the client side of things. So if you want to look at our storyboard, and yes, I'm using storyboards, don't judge me, you can see that we have a navigation controller, which includes these two screens that are going to make up our app. Our initial screen here, which uses the init view controller, makes a call to our server, where it fetches the user's user ID, finds out if they're connected to a bank yet or not, and will eventually let you make a call to Plaid to get some information about your user's checking account. And then here's our Plaid link view controller, which will eventually perform the work of connecting your user's bank through Plaid. All the logic to communicate with our server has been moved into this server communicator file. Basically, anytime you want to call your server, you're just going to pass in the path of the endpoint you want to talk to. You're going to note whether it is a get or a post call, some optional parameters if you want to send any information down to the server, and then a completion handler, right? That's got a result type, which then includes your data in the case of a successful call and an error in the case of failure. You can see here, when we do get information back from the server, we print out the endpoint originally called and the data that we get back so that it's easy to kind of debug our server traffic. You can see an example of calling this method here in our init view controller, where we're getting some information about our user. And we're basically performing a little switch based on the result type. So if the result type is success, then we get our data back as a user status response struct, which we can then make use of as needed. And if it's a failure, then we can just print out this failure message. I'm told this pattern is pretty idiomatic Swift, so I'm hoping this looks familiar to all of you Swift developers. And then the structs that represent the potential responses that we get back from our server are all here in our server responses file. And that is our app. With me so far? Good. So let's get the first big feature into our app, and that's letting our user connect your application to their bank using Plaid. Now, in spite of everything I just said earlier, this is the one time where your client is going to be communicating directly with Plaid. And your application is going to do that by using a UI widget that we provide called Link. Link handles all the heavy lifting that's needed in order to do things like pass along your user's credentials, deal with two-factor auth, selecting accounts, accepting terms and conditions, and much more depending on the product flow. Now, for Link to work properly, we need to pass it a Link token. This is a short-lived token that is generated on the server that both confirms that this Link session really belongs to your application and contains some information about how Link should work. So here's what our application is going to do. When our user opens up this Plaid view controller so they can start connecting with Plaid, our client is going to tell our server that we need a Link token. Our server will then talk to Plaid to request that Link token. Along the way, yes, we'll also pass along our client ID and secret so Plaid knows it's really us. Plaid will send a Link token back to our server, which we can then send back to our application, which it can then use to open Link. So let's get that part working. Now, to get our server up and running with Plaid, we're going to be using the Plaid Node.js library on our server. This simplifies the process of talking to Plaid, including sending along like our client ID and secret with every call we make. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll head on over to our server.js code, and up at the top here, let's uncomment these lines here. And what we're doing here is we are creating a configuration object, which we then can use to initialize our Plaid client library. Here you'll notice we're telling it, go ahead and set our client ID and secret as headers with every call. And this is also telling us what environment it should be talking to. And I'll explain environments in just a minute. Now you can see that our code here is grabbing these values from environment variables, which are defined here in my .env file. In a real application, you'd probably want to use something more secure like a secrets manager that your cloud platform provider has, but a separate file like this should work for now. And yeah, I know it's a little confusing that we call this the Plaid client library when it's running on a server, but naming things is hard. All right, so let's finish filling out these values. I'm going to head on over to the Plaid dashboard, and I'm going to head on over to developers, and under keys, I'm going to copy our client ID, and I will paste it in our env file right up here. Now we're also going to need to copy over our secret. And depending on your setup, you may see a secret for up to 3 different environments. Sandbox is used for sort of early development purposes. You have nearly unlimited use of all the Plaid products for free, but you're not going to be touching any real data. Development is a free environment with access to real customer data, but you're limited to about 100 logins. And production is, well, production. You're going to be working with real customer data with as many users as you'd like, but you're going to be billed for usage. So now for our application, we'll use Sandbox. It's free to use, has no setup time, and we don't have to worry about actually touching any real customer data. So I'm going to copy the secret here, and I am going to paste it here. And I do want to emphasize here that this secret key really should be kept secret. Anybody who has access to your client ID and secret would be able to make Plaid requests on your behalf, which is potentially a security risk, not to mention the fact that you might start getting billed for all of those API calls. Now, obviously, leaking our Sandbox secret isn't as much of an issue, but I think it's just good practice to get used to treating these things with care. Okay, so if I save my file, you can see down here that it looks like our server has restarted, and now I should be able to make some calls to the Plaid API. So let's do that. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is have our client ping this generate link token endpoint so that we can generate our link token. So first, let's go to the client to start that request. So make sure you're back in Xcode, head on over to your Plaid link view controller. And here under fetch link token, we're going to create a call to self communicator, call my server with the path of let's see, we'll say server generate link token with the method of post. And if we go ahead and run this, I'll click connect, jump to this view controller, and you can see that it's called our server. And we're just getting back a little JSON object that's reminding us that this endpoint has not been implemented. So let's tackle that next. So back in our server, make sure you are at this generate link token endpoint. Now, since this is a iOS tutorial and maybe you don't want to be spending your time messing with JavaScript, all the server level code is already written for you, but we have it commented out here. So let's uncomment this first section and let's take a look at what this code actually does. Now up here, you'll see that our create token response is awaiting the result of a call to link token create that we call through the Plaid client library. This will be the call that actually generates a link token. Now, this call takes in a configuration object, which itself contains a whole bunch of information about the link session that we want to create. And there are a lot of values we can pass in here depending on the products that we're using. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the most common or maybe some of the required ones. First, we're going to pass in a user object. This is where we can pass in our client user ID. And this is just like the internal ID of our user as identified by our application. This can be really useful when like your support team is searching the logs on behalf of a user who might be having trouble. You can perform that search by this client user ID. And, in our case, we're going to get that up here by fetching our user record from like our fake database. And then we're just going to grab the user ID field that gets set as this variable, which we set in here. Now, client name is the name of our application. This will show up in like our link flow. So let's just call this like, I don't know, video demo. Give it a slightly fun name. There we go. Country codes here will specify what countries our application supports. I'm in the US, so I'm going to stick with US here. Language is the language you would like the link session to run in. Now, products is the list of products that we are requiring the financial institution to support in order for them to show up when the user is selecting their bank. If their bank doesn't support this product, it won't show up in the list. Now, our application will eventually be making a call to the auth product. That's the product that fetches verified routing and account numbers, so we'll make that required by listing that product here. If you are using multiple products, you'll want to check the docs for like best practices on how to set that up before you launch in production, but I think this should do for now. There are some times when Plaid will need to proactively talk to your application. Sometimes it's to let you know that there's new data available for a product, or maybe that it's having trouble accessing your user's data and that they're going to need to reconnect to their bank. For situations like that, Plaid will communicate with your server through a webhook. A webhook is basically a URL that you set up on your server for the express purpose of receiving these HTTP calls from Plaid. So I'm just going to kind of leave in this dummy webhook for now. It won't actually work, but that's fine. In a real application, you would want to make this an actual server endpoint. And by the way, I do have a whole video on how to set up and test webhooks that you can check out in the description below. So I think that'll do for now. Now, typically when we get a response back from the Plaid client library, most of the data that we're interested in is going to be the data property of this response. So that's what I'm fetching here. And then I'm just going to console log it for now. So now we can give this another try. I'll go back into my client. All I really need to do is sort of leave this view controller and come back to generate a new request. And let's see what we get in our server logs. All right, so it looks like this object has 3 pieces of information. The expiration, which is set to about 4 hours from now. The link token, which is the thing that we are going to need to send back to our client. And a request ID. Plaid returns a request ID with just about every call you make to the service. It can be often useful for logging purposes, but we don't need it for now. So I think we're just going to send these first 2 values up to our client. So let's have our response object here consist of a JSON object that includes our expiration value and a link token. Note, by the way, that I'm using camel case here. That is the name that our Swift codable struct is expecting. If I head on over back to Xcode, you can see it there, link token and expiration. So we do need to make sure that it matches exactly. By the way, I'm returning early out of this function here because if your server tries to send this second response object after already having sent this first one up here, it'll cause your server to print out all sorts of error messages, and we don't want that. Feel free to delete this return line as long as you also delete this second response JSON line underneath it. This should work just fine. And so now I've saved my file. My server has restarted. If I head back into my application, I'm going to leave and come back into our Plaid view controller one more time. We can see that our data has been successfully received on our client. All right, so next up, I think we probably want to set up a proper completion handler for this thing on our client. So I'm going to head back into our Plaid link view controller. Let's set up our completion handler. We'll call this result of type this. And then let's switch based on the result type. So in success, we will save the link token in our link token property up here. Oops. Looks like I forgot to change this type to, it's not generic, it is of type link token create response. Okay, there we go. And yes, all right, so now we get our link token. And while we're at it, we can now enable the connect to bank button. That's the start link button. So we'll say that is enabled equals true. And I guess on failure, let's just, I don't know, print the error. All right, so now we have the token that we need to call link. So let's start working on that next. And the first thing we're going to need to do here is install the link library from Plaid. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Swift package manager to install LinkKit, which is the library that Plaid uses to display the link widget. So let's see here. I'm going to go under project and under package dependencies. I'll hit this plus sign here. And if you were to head over into our documentation, you would find the GitHub page of our library, which is, this one here. I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to paste that into our search bar here. All these other values you can probably just leave as their default. Make sure it's adding it to this project and click on add package. It'll think for a little bit and then click add package again. And there we go. We should now have link set up in our package dependencies. At the time of this video, it is 461. And now that we've done that, we can start actually implementing link for real. So the first thing we're going to do is create a link configuration object. This is an object where we set our link token and also where we would define all the callbacks that we might want to call once a user successfully completes link or maybe exits out early. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import LinkKit up here. And then in our start link was pressed button, let's add a little guard let link token equal link token, just to make sure it's been set properly. And then we'll let config equal create link configuration where we pass along this link token. And what is this method? It's defined right up here. And so now we need to fill it out. So in our create link configuration method, first thing we're going to do is we're going to change our return type to link token configuration. Pretty convenient that I have that there in the comments to copy and paste, huh? Then let's see, we'll set var link token config equal to link token configuration, where we pass in our token. And now for our callback handler, let's just make something real simple for now. We'll just kind of print out what we get back here in this completion handler. But don't worry, we'll be doing more with this later. While we're here, it might also be a good idea to add a on exit handler. So we can have our link token config on exit. Now this will get called when a user exits link without making a connection, either because they have intentionally quit out early or maybe some other sort of error happened. Either way, you'll probably want to make a note of that. And this is a good place to do that. So I'll just say link event in user exited link early. Speaking of logging, a lot of customers like to log any sort of intermediate events that they might encounter along the way for like analytics purposes. And we're going to do that by adding this onEvent callback handler. This ends up including a lot of metadata that is certainly helpful at times, but it can also be really noisy. So I think just for now, I am only going to print out the event name instead of all the additional metadata. And then finally, we're just going to want to return that link token config object that we have created. All right, so back to our start link was pressed call. Now that we have our configuration object, we can let our creation result equal plaid.create. We're passing along config, the link token configuration object that we just created. And then, we can kind of switch based on the result type. Now, if this is successful, we'll get back a handler in the enum. And then we can call open present using, view controller self. And that will basically present link on top of our current view controller. But it's important to note that this handler needs to stick around in memory. It's going to get dereferenced right away if I keep it like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this line up here where we have set handler as a property for our class. And then I can maybe before calling this, I'll let self.handler equal handler. And otherwise, in the case of failure, we'll just, print out the error. When would you get an error here? Honestly, almost never, unless, like you were to return something here that's not actually a link token configuration object or something. But, we got to cover all our bases anyway. Now, I should point out that I decided to fetch our link token here at this point in our view did load, right? This is when our user navigates to our connect to Plaid view controller. And I think it's at this point that it's fairly obvious that my user intends to connect to Plaid. And so fetching it here instead of like when my application first loads, means that one, I have a fairly fresh link token. Remember, these do expire after a few hours. And also, I'm not creating a bunch of link tokens more often than I need to. Alternatively, I suppose I could have generated a link token here when our user first clicked the connect to my bank button. That would give me a very fresh bank token, but then we would have to wait for our app to make that extra network call back to our server to generate a link token before we can create this configuration object, and therefore before we can kind of see anything happen. So I think, doing it here in view did load is probably the sort of best trade-off between link freshness and latency. So I think we have everything we need now to test opening link in our application. So let's try it. I'm going to run my app again. Might take a little longer to build because it's installing that other library. But once again, it's telling me I need to connect to a bank. And I'm going to do that. And looks like I've gotten back a valid link token, and this start button is enabled. So let's click it. And by the way, in a real application, you probably wouldn't call it start link because, that's not really a term that our public sees very much. You might just call it connect to my bank. And you can see here that it's popping up another view controller that will start the whole Plaid connection process. See, that's the name that we specified when we first generated our link token on the server. So I'll click continue. And then I will connect to my bank. Now, because I'm in the sandbox environment, yes, these all might look like real banks, but none of them will actually connect to any real data. So go ahead and, pick any one you want, but I'm going to say maybe, don't pick one of these large banks up here because these large ones will go through our fake OAuth flow and we haven't really set OAuth up yet. But I think this one will probably work. Now we're being asked to put in our credentials. For all banks in sandbox environment, the username is always going to be user_good. And the password is going to be pass_good. If you do get asked for any kind of two-factor auth information, the code is always going to be 1234. And now we get a chance to pick the account that we want to share. You can configure this flow, by the way, to include like all accounts by default, let the user select only one, or I guess what I'm doing here, let them select one or more. So I will pick my checking account. I'll say continue. And we are done. So let's see what happened here. If we were to take a look at the metadata that we printed out as part of the success object, you can see some information about the financial institution and the account that we connected to. Like, let's see here. Here's the name of the account that got picked. It looks like it's called Plaid Checking, and it is a depository account of subtype checking. Here's the account mask. Here is a unique ID that you'll be able to use to reference this account on the future. And this information is nice to have on the client, but you can always fetch this information server side as well. So I'm not actually going to do anything with most of this data. The one piece of data that you are going to be interested in is this public token here. Now, this public token is a short-lived token that has only one purpose, and that's for you to send this token back down to your server. Your server will then send it along to Plaid. Plaid will make sure it corresponds to a recently completed link session, and then it will give you back a more permanent access token. So from now on, anytime you want to access this user's data on their behalf, you would do it by sending that access token to Plaid along with your request. This connection to a bank, by the way, is something that we call an item, and you'll see us use that phrase a lot in our documentation and our endpoints. So let's do this part. Let's swap out our public token for an access token. So I'm going to need to take the public token that is included as part of the success object here in our callback and pass it back to our server. And I will do that by calling on our client exchange public token for access token. And our public token here is going to be success.public token as the parameter. And then in our exchange public token for access token method, we'll just call self communicator, call my server, and the path here is going to be server swap public token. That's the name of our endpoint. Let me spell it right. Good. With a method of post. And then our parameters are going to consist of public token with the actual public token that gets passed into this method. Now, if we were to run this, and you don't have to, but you would see that our server returns right now a to-do object for this endpoint. So let's implement that next. Here on the server, we will jump down to our swap public token endpoint, and let's uncomment this first part. So here on our server, we can see that result will be, await Plaid client, and here we're calling item public token exchange and passing in as our public token, the public token that gets sent in to our request. And then, for now, I'm just going to console log the data that we get back from this result. So let me save this. I'm going to rerun my app so you can see the results of this call. You don't really need to do this with me unless you really want to. But you can see that what we get back is an access token and an item ID. Now, as I mentioned before, the access token is what you're going to need to request information on behalf of this user in the future. So it's really important that we store this for later. The item ID is kind of like the public identifier associated with this access token. You use this item ID to, track down this item if you were searching through our logs or like talking to our customer support team, something like that. So, let's store this too. So I'm going to uncomment the rest of this function here. And, you can see that we're now passing this information along to our update user record function. You notice we're storing our access token and our item ID, as well as the fact that our user is now successfully connected to a bank. In a real application, yes, not only would you be using a database, but this would probably be more of a one-to-many relationship where a user might be connected to one or more financial institutions. But, again, this is good enough for now. Now, you might be tempted to return this, data object back to the client, something like this. But this would be a bad idea. Remember, this access token is being used to access your user's data on their behalf. So you kind of want to treat it with the same kind of sensitivity as you might say, a password, which means, among other things, not sending it along to their client. So that's why we are returning a simple, success equals true kind of object here. So let me save this. You know what? I will delete this return line and this second result line here. And then back in our client, let's go ahead and handle the result. So in our completion handler here, our result is going to be a result of type swap public token response or error. And, we can again switch based on the result. Whoops. Sorry about that. There we go. Now, I suppose in theory, I should actually look at the value of the object that gets returned. Right now it's hard-coded to success equals true, but maybe it wouldn't be. So I'll leave that as a to-do. For now, as long as our server hasn't given us a 500 error, we can just pop back to our parent view controller. So self navigation controller, pop view controller. And I guess maybe we'll do that so it doesn't complain about an unused variable. And then, in the case of failure, something like that. So we'll print out an error message otherwise. There we go. All right. So let's give this one more try here. And this time, go ahead and do it with me. I'm going to, once again, go through the link process. Maybe just for fun this time, I'll select both accounts. And it looks like I am connected. You'll notice that it returned success.true, so it popped me back to the initial view controller. We're now receiving updated data from server get user info, where our status has now been changed to connected. And sure enough, if we were to look at our user JSON file here on the server, you can see that we have an item ID. Let me move this out of the way. We have an item ID, we have an access token, and our status is now set to connected. And because we're now reporting that our user is connected to a bank, we now have this button here, make a simple call, which lets us make a call to the Plaid service. It doesn't do anything yet, so let's handle that next. Now, remember that the product that I included when first creating this link token is one called OAuth. Now, this is used to get verified account and routing numbers from the user's checking or savings accounts, typically for things like ACH payments. And, in practice, a lot of developers actually will then get tokenized versions of this data that they can pass along to a third-party payment processor, which typically all happens server-side. But, we're going to ignore that for now. I just want to get some data that we can display on our client. So I'll be doing this on our client in our init view controller through this make simple call was pressed method. So we will once again call communicator, call my server. And this time our path will be server/simple auth. I believe this time it is a get call, even though maybe it shouldn't be, but that's what it is. And then, well, let's go ahead and uncomment this endpoint on our server. So just so you can see what we're doing here is we are getting our user record. We're grabbing the access token from the record that gets returned. And then we're letting our response equal, Plaid client's auth get method, which requires an access token, and that's it. From the access token, it knows what financial institution we're supposed to connect to and, what accounts are connected to that. We are console during the data we get back. This is just sort of a more fancy version of console log. It lets us print out a little more information. By calling depth.null here, this recursively prints out all the nested objects we come across. So we should be able to give this a try. My server is automatically restarted, but I'm just going to go into Xcode and rerun our client here. I shouldn't need to connect through Link again, right? Because we already have an access token from our currently logged in user. So I'm just going to click Make a Simple Call. And then if we look here in our debug output, we got a whole bunch of information here. So here you can see some information about the item. Remember, that's the thing that represents the user's connection to a bank. Here we have some information about the accounts. This is typically account information you would get with most Plaid calls. Things like the account name, the type of account that it is, the mask of the account number, a cached balance value, and an internal identifier. That's this account ID. And then this numbers object down here contains the data we're interested in. This ACH array contains like account and routing numbers of US banks. Because this is a US bank that we're connected to, that's what we have here. Again, the majority of this information is probably stuff that you would want to keep server side, but just so we can see some visual progress in our client application, I'm going to uncomment this next section of code where we'll show some information to our user. So, like we're grabbing our account name and the mask from sort of the account section of the response. And then we're going to go ahead and find the routing number of that corresponding account, here in our ACH array. And then we're just going to return those things as our JSON object. By the way, creating a JSON object like this is basically just kind of a shortcut to like routing number equals routing number and like account mask equals account mask and, so on and so forth. This is just sort of a shortcut that's a little more convenient in JavaScript. I don't know if Swift supports that, but if it doesn't, there you go. And now let's just finish up by showing some data to our user here on the client. So let's add a little completion handler. And this will be result of type, what is this, like simple auth response. And we'll do a little switch. So if the result is success, let's just like change our simple call results.text to, just show something like, hey, I retrieved routing number. And here we'll get our response.routing number and here we'll get our response.name. And, we'll just kind of like show a little fake account mask. Something like this. And we'll make sure to handle the failure case. And I think that's good. So let's run this again. Remember, I don't need to reconnect to a bank. I still have a working access token there on the server. So I'm just going to click this Make a Simple Call button. And sure enough, there is my fake routing number for my fake bank. So we're making some really good progress here, but we are not yet done. If you were to try using Link with a larger bank like, say, Chase or Bank of America, you would probably see a big old OAuth warning on the top of the fake bank page telling you how like some redirect URI isn't set. And, that's something we don't want. Now, the reason you're seeing these warnings is that for a lot of the larger banks, Plaid communicates with them using APIs that these banks have created and set up for services like ours. And we need to authenticate against these APIs using OAuth. Now, I have a full video where I explain this in much more detail, but essentially the way OAuth works is this. An app or website might say, hey there, third-party provider, in this case a bank, I want to retrieve some data on behalf of this user. So I'm going to send the user to your website. They're going to sign in and give you permission to share that data with me. And then when we're all done, please direct users back to this URL that I'm giving you. This URL, by the way, is typically called a redirect URL or URI. So when the user is all done signing in and granting your app permission, the bank will then send them back to this redirect URI. They'll often pass along some information like a one-time code that you would then send back server-side in exchange for a more permanent access token that you could use to talk to this bank in the future, kind of like Plaid's public token. Now, for security reasons, your application needs to register this redirect URL in advance with this third-party provider. And often with these banks, you'll need to do a little more work in advance to clear yourself, like filling out forms, answering questionnaires, and so on. Now, of course, you probably didn't join the exciting world of fintech just so you could spend your time filling out lots of different forms with a lot of different banks. So the way OAuth with Plaid works is that Plaid is essentially the one performing the OAuth steps with the bank. We already have established relationships with these banks. And, if you think about it, we're the one that's going to need to use the access token in the future. So, you are still going to have to fill out some forms, but at least it's just with us. And so your application treats Plaid kind of like its own OAuth provider. That is, your application will redirect your users very briefly to Plaid, which will then direct users through this OAuth flow with the banks. When it's all done, the bank will redirect its users back to Plaid, which will then redirect the user back to your application. It's almost like we have one smaller OAuth flow happening inside of a larger one. There is one other wrinkle, though, on mobile. See, for some banks, Plaid does this entire process through a web view that we just sort of pop up on top of your application. But for other banks, right now Chase, but possibly others in the future, we can send your users to the bank's native app where your user can sign in using something like Face ID. The bank will then send users back to Plaid, which will then send them back to your native app. This flow, which we call app to app, converts significantly better than cases where your user needs to enter their username and password. But to get it working, we're going to need to support this step here, where Plaid sends users back to your native app, and that means supporting universal links. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get universal links working properly with your application if they're not supported yet. Once we've done that, then we can get the OAuth flow working. So universal links is Apple's technology that allows URLs that would normally open up a website to open up your native app instead. Basically, the simplified way that it works is that your website is going to host a little file that tells Apple, hey, Apple, if anybody tries to go to this section of my website, that can actually be handled by my native application. So try to open that up instead. So in the future, when an iOS device is told to open up one of these URLs, iOS will first check to see if that URL is included in this file. If it is, and your app is installed, it will open up your application instead of going to that URL in Safari. As an additional bit of security, your client app will also need to say, yes, my app can handle URLs from this domain, so that unrelated sites can't just direct users to your app for fun. So let's do that. Now, to move forward from here, you're going to need a few things. First, you need a paid Apple developer account. You can either use a personal one or your company's, but I'm pretty sure somebody needs to be giving Apple $99 a year. You'll also need to make sure you have write access to that developer account or, know somebody in your organization who does. You'll also need write access to a website with a domain that we can use as our redirect URL. Eventually, this will be your company's website, but you can use a personal one for now, like say that domain that you bought for that side project that you never finished. It's okay, we all have one. Now, the first thing we're going to need to do is associate a real developer account with our application. So head on over to Xcode and we'll click on the project here and then click on the target. Next, select a real team associated with your account. I'm going to select this one here that says Todd Kirpelman. It's a personal development account that is part of the paid Apple developer platform, but you could also select your employers if you have admin access or know somebody who does. While you're at it, you might want to change the bundle identifier here to something that more closely resembles one that your organization might use. I'm going to go ahead and, let's pick this. This seems good. Next up, I'm going to go and look for my team ID, which you can do by heading on over to developer.apple.com and looking in the account page. You're going to scroll down a little bit. And here in the membership details section, you should be able to see your team ID right here. Keep a note of that because you will need it in a moment. Next, let's figure out what domain name you're going to have associated with this application. Eventually, this will be the domain of your website, but in the short term, you can use a personal site. Anything that's got a unique domain name where you can write to it is fine. So what you're going to need to do is create or edit a file called apple-app-site-association. This can live at the root of your website, but I think these days it's more commonly placed in a directory called .well-known. And you can actually see this file at a number of different websites if you visit them. It's kind of fun to check out. Like here's Google Maps, and here's eBay's, and here's Facebook's, right? And you can see at its core, this is basically a JSON file that lets Apple know what parts of these websites might be associated with a native app. Sometimes they get a little more sophisticated, but for our purposes, we're going to keep it pretty simple. Now, if your site already has an Apple App Site Association file, you're going to want to go ahead and edit your existing one. Otherwise, I do have an empty one here in our resources folder. Let me jump into here that you can use as a starter file. But I'm actually not going to use this one. I'm going to go ahead and open up the one that I've already created for my personal website. You can see here I have an entry from an earlier test that I did, and basically I'm going to go ahead and create another one just like it. So the format of this file has changed a little over the years. Yours might not look quite the same as this one, but you can see we've got a JSON object. In turn has a app links object, and in there we have a details array, which itself is an array of objects. Each of these objects has an app ID property that is an array of the application IDs that we're going to want to redirect to. So in my case here, I'm going to start by making a copy of this object in the details array. And then let's fill this out for my application. I believe I have, this is called plaid.video1. And so what I have here is the bundle ID of my iOS application preceded by that team ID. That's the value that I had to look up earlier on my Apple developer account. So this is what it looks like in my case. This next property here is this components property. This is basically an array of objects that contain the rules that describe what parts of your site should redirect to your native app. Like in my situation, I don't want every part of my website to redirect to this native app. Only say the parts that relate to Plaid OAuth, or in my case, my Plaid OAuth video. So my components array is only going to include this one object. Now this line here basically says anything that matches, and in my case, let's make this Plaid video. So anything that matches this Plaid video redirect /star path. And this slash here at the beginning is just saying paths. I don't know why they put a slash instead of the word path, but that's what they did. And then we have this comment to just remind us what this path refers to. So I'll say this is our OAuth redirect from our Plaid video. So basically by publishing this file, I'm telling Apple, hey, any user visiting my website that comes across this path or any of its children, you want to redirect them to this app here instead if it's installed on the user's device. For those of you who are working with older versions of the file, it might look a little more like this. Same kind of deal, but slightly different format. You can see like, here's the application, and then here are the paths. Just copy and paste any old entry and modify it as appropriate for your application, and you should probably be okay. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this file to the well-known subdirectory of my website. And if I were to load up that page, and you may need to shift reload depending on your caching, I can see there it is. Now my understanding is that it can take a while for Apple to load this new page into its CDN, but you can check if it has been loaded by going to appsiteassociation.cdn-apple.com/a/v1 and then the domain of your website. And in my case, it would help if you spelled association right. Oh, there we go. Well, gee, it looks like it has loaded the new version already, which I'll be honest is surprisingly fast. Apple's docs say it'll update its CDN within 24 hours. I've usually seen it happen within 45 minutes, maybe just because it hasn't loaded it in a while and the cache was very old. It decided to load this new version right away. So depending on your situation, you may see the new version already, but if not, we can work on other stuff while we're waiting. So this was the first step towards getting universal links working, which is having your website say that it's okay to send users to your native app. Let's get the second part working now, which is having your app say that it's okay to accept incoming links from this website. So we're going to jump back into our client app, and we're going to need to add the associated domains capability to our Xcode project. And I can do that by clicking this plus button right here and selecting associated domains. Now this works for me because I am signed in with a developer account that has write access. Behind the scenes, Xcode has gone ahead and created a new app identifier for me, which I can see in my development account. And here is the associated domains capability turned on. Again, if you don't have the capability to do this yourself with your work account, you might need to find somebody who can set this up for you and possibly download a new provisioning profile, depending on your setup. I'm not quite sure. So going back into Xcode, I'm going to go ahead and add my domain here. So I'll click the plus sign, and then I will change this entry to applinks:/kerp.net. Obviously, you want to use your domain, not mine, but don't put like HTTPS or anything in front of it. This should be all you need. One quick tip I have heard is that if you were to put $mode equals developer after the domain, Apple will ignore the cache for its app site association file and also be more forgiving around issues with their HTTPS certificate. However, this also means that this will only work on devices that are in developer mode, and then in developer mode, under the developer settings panel, you have to turn on the associated domains developer feature. I also haven't been able to get this working on the simulator, only on a real device. So for the purpose of this video, I am going to leave this out. So now, in theory, my app should be able to accept incoming calls to this domain. At this point, you might want to check that Apple has loaded your updated app site association file into its CDN, or maybe you're able to get that mode equals developer thing to work. But once one of those two things are true, then we can give this a try. So first, I'm going to run my new app with its brand new capabilities in the simulator. And now there's a few ways to test whether universal links works. You could add a link to this URL in the reminder app and then click on it. But honestly, I find the best way is to open up a command line and type xcrun symctl open URL booted. And this is basically saying, hey, let's tell the iOS simulator to open the following URL on the currently running device. Then I will type in my URL with the path that I specified earlier in my Apple App Site Association file. Something like this. And sure enough, when I run this, my simulator will try to open this URL, but instead of going to this page in Safari, look at that. It opens up my native application instead. So if you're at this point, congratulations, the hard work is done. Now all we have to do is tell Plaid that this is the URL that we should direct people to when they are done with the OAuth process. So first, we'll need to register this URL as a legitimate location in the Plaid dashboard. So within the dashboard, I'm going to go to Developers and API, and then I will click on Allow to Redirect URLs. I'm going to add a new URI. And yes, I have a lot of test URIs here. I should probably remove some of them. And I will cut and paste that URL that I just went to earlier. You'll probably be asked to enter your password again. And there you go. And so that URL will now be allowed by Plaid as one of the URLs that it sends users to after they are done signing into their bank. So now I need to tell Link that this is the redirect URL we should be doing as part of the OAuth process. And how do we do that? That's right, by opening up the configuration object when we first create a link token back on the server. Yeah, remember our server? So let's open up server.js. And so let's go to our generate link token endpoint. And then here we're going to add the redirect URI. And this does have to match exactly with what's in the dashboard, or your attempt to create a link token will fail. So, you might just want to copy and paste this URL directly from your dashboard to be safe. And that's it. And if you've worked with universal links, you might be wondering if you need to do anything to handle that incoming link. Like if you need to add anything to this scene will continue user activity method or something. But the answer here is no. It turns out Plaid isn't actually making use of that incoming URL. Link is actually polling the server on the back end to see if the auth process is done, which means that you don't have to do any work, and I'm guessing it's probably more secure anyway. So as long as these universal links redirect you back into the app, you should be fine. That's all you need to do. So let's try this one more time. I'm going to ask our app to make a new connection to a bank. And this time, I'm going to pick one of the banks that requires OAuth. This is typically one of the larger banks like, Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, and so on. Now, when you do this in Sandbox, you'll be sent to a fake bank page. Obviously, this is not Bank of America's website. It's a website to represent a fake bank that kind of replicates what the process might look like when you visit one of these OAuth banks. So you can still log in like normal with user good and passcode, although I've noticed for now you can actually just leave that blank and sign in like this, which Make signing in a little bit easier, but then we should still select what accounts we want to share. So I'll pick these two. I'm not sure if these checkmarks actually do anything, but I'm going to check them anyway. We will agree to the terms and conditions, always the most exciting part of any demo. We will confirm that these are the accounts that we want to grab information from. And there you go. Our account has been successfully linked. Now, the differences to what we might have seen before are honestly kind of subtle. Like there's no more big warning banners on top of our fake bank page. And I think there used to be an additional, please close this page to continue kind of page that we no longer have to close because we're able to continue directly in our app. Now you might be like, really? We did all that work just to remove one please close this page button? And yeah, in Sandbox, that is the only change you will notice for now, although we are going to be adding some more capabilities in Sandbox in the future, so stay tuned. But when your app goes into production, that's when you're really going to see the benefits of this app-to-app flow. Now, if you want to try this yourself, you're going to need to have OAuth enabled in a production account. And this involves a few steps. Now, they're all listed here in the Plaid dashboard under Settings, US OAuth Institutions. And this includes several steps like requesting and receiving access to the production environment, filling out a security questionnaire. And yes, this questionnaire can look very intimidating, but generally speaking, the team is pretty understanding that different size companies at different stages of development have different capabilities. So just answer it as best as you can, and you're usually able to get some form of access. And then of course, providing a little more information about your company, possibly agreeing to some more terms and conditions, fun stuff like that. This process can take a while. And if you do have a Plaid representative you're working with, I would recommend chatting with them to help expedite the process. But once you do have access, you should be able to switch to the production environment by changing this line to production, changing out your Plaid secret to a new one, and giving yourself a new ID. I usually like to remind myself that this is a production user just so I'm extra careful with the data. And then if you launch your app on a real device and you are a Chase customer with the Chase app installed, you should be able to see the full app-to-app flow in all of its glory. In fact, let me show you. This is a recording I took earlier on my iPhone using this app in the production environment. You can see that I start like usual and then select Chase as my bank. This time, instead of popping up any sort of web view, my app is able to redirect me directly to the Chase app, where I log in using Face ID. And at this point, I go through an OAuth flow supplied by Chase in their app. You can see I grant permission for Chase to share my information, see what data they're going to share, and decide what accounts I want to share. When I'm all done, I'm briefly redirected to an interstitial Plaid hosted page, which then redirects me back to our app. So there we have it. That's what you need to know to get Plaid working on iOS. Now, I know I covered a lot of material in this video, so if you have any further questions about Plaid basics or OAuth or webhooks, you can check out some of the other videos in this channel. But if you feel like you've got a pretty good handle on things, you can also check out some of the product-specific videos so you can go ahead and start implementing some of those products. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to check out the documentation for the most up-to-date information, and I will see you soon on another episode of Plaid Academy.